Mindfulness it's really a practice of returning to the moment in its purest form. So it's releasing the need to dramatize the moment, and in that way, really awakening to how sacred the moment really is in just the way it naturally presents itself. So for me, I grew up in a spiritual and religious household. My parents are Sikh, and I'm originally from Punjab, which is in northwest India. And I grew up in a household that was really intentional about the way that they engaged with religion and spiritual doctrine and practice. So ritual was a really big part of my parents' lives. So I always witnessed this understanding of creating space around engaging with the mind, engaging with the body, and engaging with God. Or perhaps you can call it some divine power. Although that was very intriguing to me and definitely sort of catalyzed my inclination to look inward and be really interested in spirituality, it wasn't until I was studying fashion actually in London. I went to the London School of Fashion and I began to study Buddhism. And Buddhism to me was really the place where I felt as though I was seen in such a palpable way, like I had never been seen before. And part of that is because within Sikhism, I wasn't really hearing what I needed to be told. And the first noble truth in Buddhism, which is the first teaching that the Buddha shared upon becoming enlightened, is that life is suffering. And what he means by that is that the way we experience life entails suffering. Not that life inherently is suffering, but the way that we are in relationship to life usually is a way that will manifest in some forms of discontent, of being unsatisfied. So for me, studying Buddhism, I was really drawn to that truth because immediately I felt as though that was my experience. I was like, yes, the way that I'm experiencing my life is not working for me. And from that point, I really began to study mindfulness and study the different practices. And from really that journey have been led into studying Tibetan Buddhism, which is a lineage that I practice in. And I didn't really choose Tibetan really to begin with. Every teacher that I was drawn to, every time that I was drawn to a specific text or a book, it happened to be Tibetan or a Tibetan teacher. So I knew that there was something about the way that these teachers are practicing that I felt like I could really settle into. So really from that place, I have been practicing since, and have been practicing with my mentors, and it's been a journey, but a pleasant one nonetheless. My perception drastically changed. And the number one thing that happened that was most prominent for me is this need to pathologize my experience began to diminish. This need really to problematize what was happening in the moment, what I was feeling, my relationship to specific things softened. And what happened by virtue of that is that my resistance to what was actually happening also began to soften. So really, I felt free in the sense that I wasn't in constant war with myself. And I'm careful about the word freedom because by no means do I state that I've experienced freedom, true freedom, not nearly, or like true liberation, not even close. But I experienced enough by practicing to know that I want to continue, to know that there was a little bit more spaciousness in the way that I perceived myself and the way that I perceived others. And really, what that allowed me to do was to be incredibly compassionate with myself and with my moment-to-moment experience. And because of that, extend that compassion to people around me. So I've noticed that the degree to which I was able to be accepting, non-judgmental, and adopt a wholesome attitude toward who I was, I could do the same to other people. And if I was struggling to accept or prevent myself from judging other people, it usually was because I was doing that to myself first. And that's kind of um, the pathway in which my relationships took. So for me, it's really been a gradual process of softening, of opening, and really of abiding in trust, which was something that I really, really struggled with. The Buddha has this teaching called the suffering of suffering. And what the suffering of suffering illustrates is that when we're experiencing anger, when we're experiencing loss or grief, for instance, that's already difficult enough. That's already suffering in and of itself. There's something tremendously hurtful that is happening, and that's the fact of this moment. But what humans tend to do, and this is because the mind has a natural inclination to grasp and exacerbate what's going on out of the need to protect. I think that's important to mention. The mind simply does this because it thinks that this is the best way to protect oneself. But what happens is we begin to resist the pain, we begin to control the grief, we begin to repress the anger, and that's the suffering of suffering. That's this additional layer of complex pain and complex emotion that doesn't need to be there. It's a way of relating to our experience that is actually making it worse. So by softening, I mean working to remove this secondary layer of trying to constantly conceptualize, package, and manipulate the truth of what's going on. And this can be done, on both ends of the spectrum, whether it's pushing away what's uncomfortable, but also grasping onto what's pleasant. For example, a common metaphor is using an ice cream cone, but just because it's more personal, I'll use a cup of tea. When you make like an amazing cup of tea and you love it, there's this need to instantly think about what's going to happen when that cup of tea is over, and to want another cup of tea, and to think about the next moment and the next moment, and to really grasp onto and elongate what's happening now, instead of just enjoying the cup of tea, enjoying when it's over, and like really being at peace with that. So the Buddhist metaphor, which a lot of teachers speak about, is the ice cream cone. We're so worried about the ice cream cone being finished that we're not enjoying the actual ice cream. And once it's over, we want more because we're not actually resting in just joy of what's happening right now. So that's the softening. And in terms of the dramatizing is simply, again, this natural inclination for the monkey mind to create a story. Really what mindfulness is doing, one of the strongest pillars of this practice, and I would say one of the strongest goals, and I say that because it's important not to really focus too much on striving, which is kind of the beautiful paradox about these practices, is that we want to rest in direct experience. And that just means the feeling body. How does it feel to be in this moment? Not what story am I telling about this moment, but what are the actual sensations that are arising, the actual sounds, the actual contents of my experience, without the need to speak about my experience in my head. And when you begin to practice, you start to recognize this consistent, ongoing dialogue that you have about everything you do. I was just walking to Pilates this morning, and I had a similar experience. I was like, wow, my mind is crazy. I crossed the road too soon, then all of a sudden it was like, I'm going to die. What about my mom? And just it went on, and I was like, just cross the street. So it's not me, it's not you, it's the mind. The mind will do this. I think that yes, that mindfulness ought to be a necessary skill in how we relate to our day-to-day experience. And one of the reasons I say that is because meditation really is a beautiful refuge to hold and celebrate nuance and complexity, because that's really what life is. Very rarely are we on either end of any spectrum. Most of us on most things fall into some nuance. It's gray. It doesn't always look a particular way. It doesn't always feel a particular way. There are multiple layers to opinions that we have and belief systems, and it's not so simple. And I think where mindfulness can be especially helpful is allowing us to rest in a space of safety within. And whether that's by the neuroscientific research that's being done now and the physiological research, which is showing that mindfulness, after I think 20 minutes for 8 weeks, 20 minutes a day for 8 weeks, you begin to see subtle structural changes in the brain. I do think it's also important to mention that a lot of this research is very preliminary, so there's a lot more research that has to be done. But even if we just forget about research and we just speak about anecdotal experience, what mindfulness allows us to do is to abide in the space of safety so that we don't feel as though we have to constantly protect ourselves. And what I think a lot of us don't realize is that when we're unable to hold the viewpoint of another or the opinion or whatever it is of another, that is some degree of protection arising. It's some block that's arising because of our fear to become attuned to what the other person is experiencing. So when different people look differently, when there are different ethnicities and racial identities and different forms of identity that get involved, it can become very primitive very quickly because that's within us. From an evolutionary psychological perspective, that's within us to protect who looks like us and stay away from those who don't. So if we're not careful, and this is what has happened, we will begin to reject anything that doesn't look or sound or resemble what we believe to be right. And that doesn't mean to say that there isn't objective morality. There aren't things that are just good and there aren't things that are just purely unethical, of course. But it means to say that nobody changes and no healing and no growth is done through contraction. It's not done through the lens of violence. It's done through actively listening with compassion. And that can only happen when we can celebrate the nuance and complexity within our own experience and then begin to extend it to others. If we're unable to hold two contradictory thoughts or emotions within our own day-to-day experience, it's very difficult to do that for other people. It's very difficult to believe something and allow someone else to believe something different. So I would say, again, mindfulness has always been and will continue to be the training ground in which human beings can, if they choose to, flourish interpersonally. Everything happens in relationship. And if we're not willing to heal in relationship, then things, I think, will continue to become quite polarized. And I think we're already there, but quite dangerous. With cancel culture, with identity politics, with this need to reject anything that doesn't feel safe, I think it's incredibly, incredibly dangerous if it's not done in the spirit of compassion. There are growing pains anytime we leave our comfort zone. But so a phrase that I heard recently, I think it was a clinical psychologist that I've been following, and she referred to this need to keep things as they have always been as unhealthy peace. And she actually argued that unhealthy peace is much more destructive than unhealthy conflict. Because when it's conflict, we see it's conflict. But when it's unhealthy peace, we're mistaken. We have this idea that this is what peace is, this is what ease is, this is what happiness is. And it's not really until we bring a more questioning kind of perspective and we investigate our experience that we actually realize what it means to be in harmony with our experience. So I would say that yes, it's not necessarily the most seductive practice to begin with, which I don't think anything is. And like, let's talk about eating healthy or going to the gym or breaking any habit, because that's what meditation invites you to do, to break old habits. That's never pleasant, but it's much more rewarding because it's actually genuine. It's actually nourishing. So I would say that another important piece of this is that you naturally begin, I think, when you're adjusting your mind frame, to seek out sources of support that are more aligned with how you're feeling. And because of that, just as a natural result, it's possible and very likely that you may begin to actually cultivate new relationships that are based on mutual trust, reciprocity, respect, and the genuine wish for one another to flourish, than just habit or any other bond that maybe was, really the focal point before, that wasn't serving each party. So I would say that it can get lonely. It was very lonely for me because everyone in my life at that time wasn't practicing. And I realized actually how misaligned I was with so many of the friendships I had and relationships I was in. It just actually wasn't what I really wanted. But now I'm in a place where I have the friendships I genuinely want. I'm working for the people I genuinely want to be working with. I'm in a relationship with someone that I feel is really beautifully aligned. But it does take adjustment. And I think that, like everything worthwhile, there are growing pains involved. That's a really tricky question. Happiness, I would say it's, for me, and I can only really speak about it from my experience, is a particular orientation toward my experience, toward my life. It isn't contingent upon external factors, and that doesn't mean that I'm diminishing the importance of them, because they're very, very, very important. And I think that that's sometimes underappreciated. If you don't have a meaningful job, if you don't have a job, if you don't feel safe or as if your basic needs are being met, if you don't feel secure and loved and as though you have a support system, it's very normal to feel unhappy. And that doesn't mean that someone isn't doing mindfulness enough. That means you're human and that these things are necessary to live a well-lived life. So that's why it's tricky, because I think that sometimes it can be misconstrued where people assume that it's actually about renunciation. I'm supposed to want nothing and just be happy all the time. Not necessarily. And in fact, to be frank, I'm not happy all the time. I can assure you that. But what I can choose to be fairly often, and that doesn't mean that I am, but I can choose to be it, is in harmony. And to me, that's happiness. I'm not in conflict. I'm not fighting what's happening. And if that means that I'm experiencing a lot of grief because I've lost a loved one, then I'm experiencing grief, and I can be joyful in that moment. I can be at peace with my experience and find reasons to cultivate appreciation for what I do feel is bringing me joy. And even meeting my practice and meeting my experience with an accepting attitude can be joyful in and of itself. So, I would say that it's really important when we're practicing not to have this end goal in mind of releasing the emotion or really doing anything. And I say that because it's very subtle, this grasping of trying to find that thing to see if we're doing it right. But if we have a certain amount of this kind of preconceived notion about what the practice should be, it will infiltrate and cloud the actual practice. But if we can commit to being curious and if we can commit to being open, then I think that's where genuine joy can come from. and genuine release of like processing something and moving on. But if we're meditating to release it, that's when it gets tricky, because then we're like, okay, it's still here. Next day, okay, it's still here. But if we're meditating to build a relationship to the moment, then it's not so much about what happens with the emotion or with the experience, but rather how we can be with it. Well, first, I like to translate meditation in the Tibetan language, and meditation is translated into this word gom, which means to become intimately familiar with. So that's what we're doing when we're meditating, is to become intimately familiar with our experience, with this moment as it is. I sum up mindfulness really in a very simple way. And of course, this doesn't do the practice justice in its full beauty, but really what we're doing when we're practicing mindfulness is to know the mind, to better understand the mind, so that we can see the things that we do that lead to happiness and the things that we do that lead to suffering, and work to stop doing the things that lead to suffering and continue cultivating and strengthening those habits and modes of behavior that lead to peacefulness. So that's what we're doing in mindfulness. And the way that we do that is by focusing on the breath as one of the foundations of mindfulness, to stabilize the mind. And if we can't stabilize the mind, it becomes very difficult to actually see clearly. So we want to focus on a fixed point, and the fixed point is typically the breath, but it could be a mantra, it could be an image, it could be, anything. It could be a smell. It's just an object that we focus on, and we focus on this object as a way of allowing the mind to naturally settle in its own time. So the way that I will really speak about the mind wandering is that your mind will wander. Your mind will always wander. That is not the problem. But what we're trying to do in this practice is, as we're focusing on this object, notice when the mind wanders, acknowledge that it's happening, and bring it back to this object. So this accepting of the wandering mind, I think, provides people with a lot of ease, because they realize that it actually isn't important if my mind wanders or not. What's important is, what do I do when my mind wanders? Do I engage in self-criticism? Do I go into a hole of loathing? Am I beginning to fault myself? Like, what's happening when that's happening? And that's where curiosity comes in. But that's really the way that I explain the practice, is that we're focusing on a fixed object, we're noticing what else is arising as it arises, and returning back to the fixed object. There are many similar metaphors, like clouds in the sky, cars on the highway, you name it. There are so many. But I do think that what you said is really important, in that it's a practice in which the experiential component is very crucial. And that's why I think it's difficult for a lot of people, because you cannot intellectualize your way into or out of healing. It must it must happen through the felt sense of the body. And that's really hard sometimes. I would say every day is important. The consistency is definitely the most important thing. The duration, actually, not so much, especially if you're starting out. It's not wise to meditate for 20 or 30 minutes if you've never meditated before. And a helpful metaphor I give is, you would never wake up one day and run the New York City Marathon. Nobody would ever do that. People would choose to do something, and they would train months in advance, and sometimes even a year in advance, eating properly, exercising, creating a huge lifestyle adjustment to accomplish this, really remarkable feat. Meditation is similar. We have to work our way up. The mind is a muscle, the brain is a muscle. And if we're not strengthening the muscle with our genuine, honest capacity right here, right now, it's very likely we'll actually harm ourselves. We'll push ourselves too far, or what is more common, we immediately think that meditation isn't for us. I'm bad at meditating. You're not bad at meditating, but anyone that's never sat with their mind in, in a peaceful way for a long period of time won't be able to do it. Again, that's just the nature of the mind. So the really, really main thing, the most important thing is start slow. 5 minutes a day is fantastic if you're new, but do it every day. The consistency is the most important thing. And also, really a lot of Tibetan scholars also emphasize this, the rigor and the kind of discipline in which you meet your practice is very important. So if you're practicing for 15 minutes, but your mind is wandering for 15 minutes, you're just practicing mind wandering. So it's better to just practice for 3 minutes and focus and strengthen that. So do 3 minutes, 3 minutes, 3 minutes, maybe the next month, 4 minutes. Then do 15 minutes of mind wandering, because the next month it'll just be 15 more minutes of mind wandering. And that doesn't mean to say that sometimes we don't all have days where the mind is just crazy, but especially as we're starting out, be sincere, take your time and recognize that there's absolutely no rush. What's the finish line here? Liberation likely won't happen for a few lifetimes. So let's just take our time and really, really get to know ourselves. I do not compromise on sleep. I try to get 8.5 to 9 hours every night, and I'm usually quite successful. I think sleep is incredibly important for mental clarity, for physical ease, for just focus and precision. It's very important to nurture the body. So going on that, eating a fairly clean diet, moving regularly. Pilates is definitely my go-to practice. Taking baths. I mean, I take a bath pretty much every day, and just soak in the bath for 20 or 30 minutes. And the good thing with COVID is if I have to work, I can just bring my laptop into the bath. So I just have a desk on the side. So they're not always tech-free baths, but you got to do what you got to do. And nourishment. So for me, really my relationships, a lot of play and a lot of freedom with people that I love, going to galleries and museums and cooking food and watching movies and just being around people that I feel very safe with and very seen by, I think is incredibly, incredibly important to me. And then also reading. I like stillness and silence. So every morning my phone is on airplane mode for at least an hour, and I spend the first hour, I make a cup of tea and I read. Just the act and the medium of literature and reading, it's really therapeutic for me. A positively transforming world is a world that seeks to know itself. Seeks to know itself so that each one of us can take responsibility for the ways that we show up and create enough spaciousness that we can support our own flourishing and the flourishing of others. Awareness is key, and not just any type of awareness, but compassionate awareness. So for me, really seeing that infiltrate into the masses, into the way that people move and eat and dance and create businesses and create families, that really is for me what a positively transforming world is.